Hello Waka friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Nicole and today I have a beautiful waterfall landscape for you. So yes, lots of fun techniques. Let's get right into it. Alright guys, let's talk supplies real quick. You are going to need some good watercolor paper. I do like to use the Hahnemuhl collection series or arches. You're going to need paper towels, water container, a flat brush, some round brushes, and then some smaller detail brushes. You'll also need a fine needle applicator bottle or a spray bottle that you can set on a stream. And then, of course, watercolor paints of your choice. So let's get right into it. So for the cliff, we are going to start off wet on wet, and I'm going to just wet the cliff area. I am going to leave the sky paper white for the contrast to the cliff, and of course not to take away from the cliff, as that's the main attraction. So once you have that area where the cliff is nice and wet, I'm coming in with my lightest colors, which I have used for the cliff all in all: buff titanium, sepia, burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna, and indigo blue. So I'm keeping an eye on my reference photo, and I am just tapping in shapes at this point. You don't want to go into any sorts of details. You just want to build up your color slowly and tap in those main shapes that you see. The fact that I keep going over these areas will also ensure that my paper stays nice and wet. So notice we're not doing any details, we're just putting in these large washes. So basically this is our roadmap to any additional layers. I'm coming in stronger with the darker colors that I see in the cliff, building up some of those darker shapes. Now I'm just rotating my canvas a bit, get the colors to bleed together. And I am using this very interesting tool that is actually meant for masking fluid. It is a fine needle nose applicator, and it is great for jutting down a forceful stream of water to create this waterfall. It is pretty cool. It does have that really nice misty effect that I'm going for. I'm going to continue adding colors even though my paper is drying. I can use less water, more paint, and still apply color. This will ensure that I don't make a bloom as long as I have less moisture in my brush than there is on the paper. And then I'm going to let that whole thing dry. Coming in for a second layer on the cliff. I have my roadmap to follow. Now I'm just going to be darkening up these colors. So I'm using a little bit of the indigo blue on the right hand side of that cliff area. I find that there's some blue hues there. And with a very transparent stain of my raw umber and burnt sienna, I just keep bringing that bead of water down the cliffside and adding these colors. So before I work any further, I'm going to try to get in all those dark colors before I continue down the page. And of course, I'm going to change up my colors as I go along so that it adds visual interest. Coming in with some sepia and getting in some of those dark striations. Some areas are wetter than others, and so you get a nice soft and hard edge approach here. Using the side of your brush, you could get a dry brush effect as long as your brush is fairly dry, and it does add a nice glaze to these rocks. Okay, go in for the very dark neutral tint and boom, that just recessed that cliff. Notice how much contrast is important. And I do suggest that you do a little thumbnail sketch first in charcoal to be able to squint at your reference photo, see where your very dark shapes are, and then you can transform that in watercolor. So at this point, my paper on that right-hand side is pretty dry. I'm able to add a lot of glazes here and just darken up those rock structures. Now they are rocks, of course, so I don't want everything fuzzy and soft. I do want some sharp edges. So once I'm happy with the values that I have on that side, I'm picking up my script liner brush and putting in a few cracks in the foreground here to add some visual interest. I do love those striations in the rocks, and I'm adding in some more detail on the top part of the cliff. Breaking up that white of the waterfalls a little bit with my buff titanium, just so that you could kind of see the rocks peeking through a little bit. Now what I did on one side, I'm going to do on the other side. I'm coming in with my buff titanium and raw umber and putting a glaze on the top of the rocks. With my round brush, while it's wet, I'm adding in some of those striation lines and even more detail with my script liner brush. I'm following the outcrop of the cliff so that it looks like some areas are recessed and some areas are rounded. Once I'm happy with that outcropping area on the top, I'm wetting the whole side of the cliff to add in all the other dark colors that I need to on this side. I have some sepia here along with my neutral tint and indigo blue. So keeping an eye on my reference photo, I'm trying to put in all those dark areas on the left-hand side. What I do to one side, I'm going to do to the other. Keeping in mind that I do want to keep that very misty appearance to the waterfall on this side though, I won't be putting in as much detail on the rocks as I did on the right-hand side. I do love the pops of color using the burnt umber, especially against the blue. Now, to give this a little bit of texture, I'm throwing water just from my fingers and I'm splashing that on the paper just to produce some atmospheric misty effects. Coming in with the script liner brush to add in some of the details of the rocks on this side. But like I said, I am going to keep them to a minimum compared to what I did on the other side. Now you're going to let that whole thing dry and we're going to start doing the trees on the top. Now I'm not going to introduce too many new colors here for the tree trunks and even a lot of the foliage. I'm using the same colors. The one color that I did add in a very diluted amount, and I mixed it a lot with my browns, is sap green and a little bit of a stronger yellow, because if you look at the reference photo, some of these trees do look like they're like fall trees. They're turning colors a little bit, or it's the way that the light is shining on these trees that makes them have this little bit of a yellow glow. For the trees, you are going to want to use a script liner brush or a very fine detail brush in order to get these trees done delicately and on a small scale. For the foliage, I like to add water to my paper a lot of the times first, or even paint with water and then drop in the colors and let them mix on the paper. On the left-hand side, I'm putting in the main tree trunks that I see. And notice I'm trying to vary them. I don't want them to be poker straight. Some of them have a little bit of a lean to them so that it looks a lot more organic. Spritzing my paper with my water bottle. I'm starting off with the lightest colors, and I just have a very loose mixture of my raw sienna, and it's mostly water, and I'm sort of dropping that into the area that I spritzed. This is where the warmest part of the trees are. And you're just going to build up your colors like this very slowly. So then once I have my lightest colors in, I could come in with a little bit of a darker color, add in some burnt sienna, especially towards the bottom of the trees. That's where the shadows are. You're going to want to add in your darkest tones like the sepia for the very bottom of the trees. So as you notice, I just go about doing the foliage in a very organic way, using water to paint in some areas and then drop in the color, let it mix on the paper. You can smear it with your finger if there's something that's too harsh that you don't like. I'm going back over to the first set of trees as that part has dried, and I do notice that my values have to be darker here in the trees. So you're going to continue on and build up your trees in the same manner, starting off very light, putting in your light tones, coming in with darker values where you need to. And then I'm just going to let that first layer dry on the trees and see what it looks like when it's completely dry. So I did decide to go back in and darken up, especially some of the tree trunks and the trees themselves, with a pretty thicker consistency of my sepia. Once I darkened up all the tree branches and trunks that I needed to darken up, I'm reevaluating the foliage to add in some darker glazes. I'm using a very watery mixture of some darker browns to add the darker areas to the underside of the trees. Now, here's where I added more of the yellow. Like I said, there is some pops of yellow. I do love that sun-kissed look. And I did add a little bit of raw sienna or whatever warm yellows I have in my palette. A little bit more pop of color. I think I might have even used quinacridone gold. So I'm producing some shadows in the bottom parts of the trees here, increasing that contrast. If you squint at your reference photo, you will see that there is a lot more darker areas towards the bottom of these trees. I also wanted to have that ledge as a focal point, adding a little bit more of a darker dry brushing effect to that ledge. I just love that ledge. So a little bit more details on those rocks near the top, and then I was okay with it. So I removed my tape, and I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you enjoyed this landscape and you would like to see how I do some sun-kissed trees, check out the next video that I have up on the screen here for you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next week.